first drawing appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, scattered among the usual collection of colorful scribbles that 4-year-old Emma created during her quiet time. Sarah Martinez had been making breakfast when she noticed her daughter hunched over her little table in the living room, tongue poking out in concentration as she worked with her crayons. Nothing unusual about that. Emma loved to draw, filling page after page with the wild imagination that only small children possess. But when Sarah glanced at the finished artwork later that morning, something made her pause. Among the typical rainbow houses and stick figure families was something different. A tall, dark figure drawn in heavy black crayon strokes, standing beside what looked like a bed. The figure had no facial features except for 2 dark circles where eyes should be, and Emma had scribbled over it repeatedly, making the entire form seem to loom from the paper with an almost oppressive darkness. "Who's this, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, pointing to the dark figure while Emma munched on her cereal. "That's the sad man," Emma replied matter-of-factly, as if Sarah should have known. "He comes to visit me at night." Sarah felt a small chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to smile. Children this age often had imaginary friends, and with all the changes in Emma's life recently, the move to this new house, starting at a new daycare, it made sense that her imagination might be working overtime. The divorce from Emma's father had been finalized just 6 months ago, and Sarah knew that children sometimes processed major life changes through fantasy and play. "What does the sad man do when he visits?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice light and curious rather than concerned. Emma looked up from her cereal, her big brown eyes serious in a way that only young children could manage when discussing something they considered important. "He sits on my bed and tells me stories. He's very lonely, Mommy. He misses his wife." The cereal spoon clattered against the bowl as Sarah's hand jerked involuntarily. Emma was 4 years old. She had never been married, never had a husband, and while she occasionally watched Disney movies that featured married couples, it seemed strange that she would create such a specific detail about an imaginary friend being lonely for his wife. "Did you dream about him, honey?" Sarah asked, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "No, he's real," Emma insisted with the unwavering certainty that small children brought to their convictions. "He stands by the window sometimes and looks outside. He told me he used to look out that window every day, waiting for her to come back." Sarah's blood went cold. Emma's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and the window faced the front of the house, overlooking the quiet residential street where they had moved just 2 months ago. How could Emma know about someone standing at that window, waiting for someone to return? The specificity of the detail felt too mature, too emotionally complex for a 4-year-old's imagination. That night, Sarah found herself checking on Emma more frequently than usual. Each time she peeked into her daughter's room, Emma was sleeping peacefully, her small form curled under the pink comforter they had picked out together when they moved in. But Sarah couldn't shake the image of that dark figure in the drawing, or the matter-of-fact way Emma had described him sitting on her bed. The drawings continued over the next week. Each morning, Sarah would find new artwork featuring the sad man. In some pictures, he was sitting on the edge of Emma's bed. In others, he stood by the window, always facing away from the viewer as if looking out at something only he could see. Emma's artistic skills were limited by her age, but the consistency of the figure was unnerving, always tall, always dark, always radiating a sense of melancholy that seemed far too sophisticated for a child's drawing. More concerning was the way Emma began to describe her nighttime visits with increasing detail. The sad man, she explained to her mother, would come to her room after she went to sleep and sit quietly on her bed. He never spoke loudly, she said, just whispered stories about being alone and missing someone very much. He would touch her face gently, she reported, with hands that felt cold and soft at the same time. Sarah's maternal instincts were screaming warnings. While she wanted to believe this was all innocent childhood imagination, the physical descriptions Emma provided made her increasingly uncomfortable. No imaginary friend should be described as touching a child, even in the context of play or dreams. She began to wonder if someone might actually be accessing Emma's room at night, perhaps through the window, or even someone with a key to the house. The house they rented was a modest two-story colonial built in the 1970s, part of a quiet neighborhood where families have lived for decades. When Sarah had signed the lease, the landlord had mentioned that the previous tenant had lived there for several years before moving out rather suddenly. He hadn't provided many details, and Sarah hadn't pressed for them. She had been focused on finding a safe, affordable place for her and Emma to start over after the divorce. But now, faced with Emma's increasingly detailed descriptions of the sad man, Sarah decided she needed more information about their home's history. She called Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who lived next door and had been friendly since they moved in. "Oh, dear," Mrs. Henderson said when Sarah explained her concern. "You're talking about Robert Morrison. He lived in your house for about 5 years before you moved in. Can you tell me about him?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Robert was a lovely man, very quiet and polite. But he went through a terrible time when his wife left him. Depression, you know. He would stand at that upstairs window for hours, especially toward the end, just watching the street like he was waiting for her to come back. Sarah's hands began to tremble. "Mrs. Henderson, what happened to Robert?" Another pause, longer this time. "Oh, honey, I thought you knew. Robert took his own life in that house. It was about 8 months ago, in the upstairs bedroom. The poor man just couldn't handle being alone anymore." The phone slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers, clattering to the kitchen floor. Emma's bedroom had been Robert Morrison's bedroom. The window where Emma said the sad man stood looking outside was the same window where Robert had spent his final months, watching and waiting for a wife who would never return. That evening, Sarah sat Emma down for a serious conversation. She showed her daughter a photo that Mrs. Henderson had provided, a picture from a neighborhood barbecue taken the summer before Robert's death. It showed a tall, thin man with dark hair and sad eyes, standing slightly apart from the other neighbors. "Emma, is this the sad man who visits you?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. Emma studied the photo carefully, then nodded solemnly. "Yes, that's him. But he looks sadder now. And he's not as colorful." "Not as colorful?" Sarah asked. "He's more gray now. Like when the TV doesn't work right." Sarah felt nauseated. Emma was describing Robert Morrison with an accuracy that should have been impossible. But more than that, she was describing him in a way that suggested she was seeing something that adults typically couldn't or wouldn't see. The situation escalated over the next few nights. Emma began waking up screaming, claiming that the sad man was trying to talk to her more and more, and that his stories were becoming longer and sadder. She described how he would sit on her bed and tell her about his wife, about how much he missed her, about how lonely he was in the house where they had planned to grow old together. Most disturbing of all, Emma began to exhibit knowledge about Robert's life that she couldn't possibly have learned anywhere else. She mentioned that he had worked with computers, that he had a brown dog that had died, that he kept pictures of his wife on a table by the window. When Sarah contacted the landlord, he confirmed these details with shock. Robert had indeed been a computer programmer, had lost his beloved dog shortly before his wife left, and had kept a shrine of photos on the windowsill. Desperate for answers, Sarah installed a security camera in Emma's room, positioning it to capture the entire space including the bed and window where Emma said the sad man appeared. She felt conflicted about monitoring her daughter's sleep, but she needed to understand what was happening. The footage from the first night made Sarah question her sanity. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the camera clearly showed Emma sitting up in bed, looking toward the foot of her mattress. For nearly 20 minutes, the 4-year-old appeared to be having a conversation with someone just out of frame. She nodded, shook her head, and even reached out as if to touch something. But the camera showed nothing else in the room, just Emma, apparently interacting with empty air. The audio was perhaps even more disturbing. Emma's voice came through clearly on the recording. "I know you're sad, but you can't stay here forever. Mommy says people have to go to heaven when they die." Then, after a pause as if listening to a response, "But you don't want to go?" "Why not?" Sarah watched this footage with growing horror. Either her 4-year-old daughter was having elaborate conversations with herself in the middle of the night, displaying a level of emotional sophistication far beyond her years, or she was actually communicating with something that the camera couldn't capture. The breaking point came on a Friday night in early November. Emma woke up screaming at 3 a.m., but this time she wouldn't calm down. She sobbed that the sad man had touched her face and told her he didn't want to be alone anymore, that he wanted her to stay with him so he wouldn't be sad. "He keeps getting more solid," Emma cried into Sarah's shoulder. "He's not gray like the TV anymore. He looks real now, and he's so sad, Mommy. He wants me to help him not be lonely." Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives. She called Mrs. Henderson at 3:30 in the morning, apologizing for the late hour but explaining that she needed to know everything about Robert Morrison's death, where exactly it had happened, what the circumstances were, and whether there had been any unusual occurrences since then. Mrs. Henderson's revelation was the final piece of a puzzle Sarah had been dreading to complete. Robert had indeed taken his life in Emma's bedroom, but more specifically, he had done so sitting on the bed, facing the window where he had spent so many hours waiting for his wife to return. He had left a note expressing his hope that she would come back and find him there, that somehow his presence in that spot would bring her home. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson added reluctantly. "The house has been difficult to rent since then. You're the third family to try to live there. The others, well, they reported some unusual experiences too. Nothing harmful, just sad. Very, very sad." The next morning, Sarah began packing. She couldn't prove what was happening in that house, couldn't explain how her 4-year-old daughter knew intimate details about a man who had died months before they moved in. But she knew with absolute certainty that Emma was interacting with something beyond the normal world, and that whatever Robert Morrison had become in death, his need for companionship was growing stronger. Parapsychologists often attribute hauntings to spirits who have suffered from violent or tragic events like suicide, and children are believed to have a thinner veil between them and the paranormal world, making them more sensitive to spiritual presences. Whether Sarah believed in ghosts or not, she believed in protecting her daughter. As they loaded their belongings into the moving truck, Emma stood at the front door, looking back at the house with an expression of genuine sadness that seemed far too mature for her 4 years. "Are we really leaving the sad man all alone?" she asked. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people need to find their own way to not be sad anymore. We can't fix everyone's loneliness." Emma nodded solemnly, then waved at the upstairs window. "Bye, sad man. I hope your wife comes back someday." As they drove away, Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror and could have sworn she saw a figure standing at that second-floor window, watching them leave. But when she looked again, the window was empty, reflecting nothing but the gray November sky. They never returned to the house on Maple Street. Sarah heard through Mrs. Henderson that it remained vacant for several more months before the landlord finally sold it to a developer who planned to tear it down. Emma never mentioned the sad man again, and her drawings returned to the typical rainbow houses and stick-figure families of childhood. But sometimes, on quiet nights when Emma was sleeping peacefully in their new home, Sarah would find herself thinking about Robert Morrison. She wondered if he had found peace, if his desperate loneliness had finally been resolved, or if he was still standing at that window, waiting for someone who would never come home. The experience taught Sarah that there are some mysteries that defy explanation, some encounters that exist in the space between the world we understand and the world we fear. Whether Emma had actually communicated with the spirit of a lonely man, or whether her young mind had somehow picked up on the residual sadness that permeated that house, the experience had been real enough to drive them from their home. In the end, Sarah decided that some questions don't need answers, they just need to be honored with the respect they deserve, and sometimes, with the distance necessary to keep the living safe from the sorrows of the dead. The sad man's story had become part of their story, but it didn't have to define their future. Emma continued to draw, but her pictures now featured bright colors and happy faces, the darkness of those October mornings replaced by the typical joy of childhood creativity. And if Sarah sometimes felt a chill when her daughter mentioned imaginary friends in their new home, she made sure to ask the right questions and pay attention to the details that mattered. Because sometimes, the most important thing a parent can do is not to dismiss what their child sees, but to believe them enough to keep them safe from whatever might be lurking in the shadows of the adult world, waiting for the innocent companionship that only a child can provide.